1,200 years ago, our world was an unrecognisable place. Looking at a map of the Eurasian landmass, a few of the names we recognise today can be seen. Embryos of nation-states that would form much later. Some considerably smaller than they are today. Others much larger. Vast, sprawling land empires, dominating certain areas, much bigger than most nations today. Others being so divided politically that each valley found itself under the rule of a local king. Of course, the worldviews and societies of many of these regions would seem alien to us today. Arguably, none more so, however, than the vast steppe land stretching from what is now Hungary and Ukraine in the west, all the way to the open Pacific in the east. It was out on these vast windy plains that the very first horse nomads in history rode forth during the mysterious epoch at the end of the Stone Age. Having domesticated the horse for the first time, before metal was even harnessed on a wide scale. Of course, this huge advantage would alter everything. Later still, down the long millennia, wave after wave of increasingly sophisticated, semi-nomadic peoples would periodically wash like waves on a shore against the settled societies on their borders. A perennial conflict between horse nomads and city builders that would continue to rage on and off until the 18th century. From the Roman Empire to Persia to China, having significant impacts upon the city builders, occasionally conquering them, fighting for them, or engaging in other ways with their societies. Each in turn influencing the other, through trade, mutual exchange, and, of course, warfare. By the year 800, after a brief period of domination from the steppe, in the form of the Huns, the Avar Khaganate, and all manner of other invading steppe empires, the aforementioned sprawling empires of the city builders, powerful once more, were really continuations of those that had come before. In Europe in particular, societies purposely attempting to imitate Roman designs in their own buildings. Building upon many of the same cities and infrastructure. In Europe, the Carolingian Franks under Charlemagne. In Persia and the Middle East, the Abbasid Caliphate under the famous Caliph Harun al-Rashid. And in China, a continuation of the old empires of antiquity. Under the Tang dynasty, arguably the most powerful of all Chinese states. One which for a time conquered the steppe, the only time a city-building civilization had ever achieved this in history. The Chinese, of course, had their own religion and ideas. The Arabs also having adopted their own unique faith, based on the monotheism of the Abrahamic religions. The Franks, of course, having adopted the religion of the Romans, which is the main faith of Russia today. However, had events played out ever so slightly differently, the entire history of the world could have been so very different. For during this far-flung epoch, there was another faith. Now a footnote in history, but for a time, one which had just as much potential as Christianity or Islam. Like these other faiths, it had a singular prophet at its core, a stringent code of right and wrong, holy books, monasteries, religious leaders, and it very nearly swept the world. Quite simply, in the year 800, Manichaeism, the followers of the prophet Mani, could have become one of the great religions of the world. But, of course, it went the other way. Who today remembers Mani? Let alone follow his teachings. Joining the plethora of religious traditions thrown down by the wayside of humanity. Now, in 2020, a vast island fortress of Inner Asia, out on the steppes of what is now southern Russia, is providing new insights into this turning point in world history. Built by a little-known Turkic people, the Uyghurs. Sophisticated, semi-nomadic pastoralists, heirs to the great Gurk-Turk Empire of the 5th and 6th centuries, who still exist today. This stunning complex has already been studied for decades, but now, using a cutting-edge carbon-14 aging technique, scientists have pinpointed its construction to an exact year. 777 CE, revealing concrete insights into why this place was built and who by. Let's take a look. Stretching out across the modern border between Russia and Mongolia. Deep in the wilderness of jagged hills and rolling plains of Inner Asia, a seemingly endless expanse, some 1,300 meters above sea level, sits a lake. And at its center, an island. Upon that island stands a ruined, ancient complex, dating back to a time long before Russians or Mongolians laid claim to these lands. A time when this landscape served as the heartland of an earlier people, the Uyghurs. A Turkic semi-nomadic confederation of tribes. This is the Tuva Mountains in what is now Russia. And that ruin, measuring some 215 by 162 metres, with outer walls 12 metres high, known as the Por Bajin complex, has been a mystery ever since it was discovered in the 18th century. Translated as clay house, built on a foundation of wooden beams. The Por Bajin complex, though an impressive structure any people of the time would have been proud of, appears to have never been used. Those who built it having drifted away long ago. Fairly accurate chronologies of steppe rulers, acquired from a multitude of sources, including Chinese chronicles and runic marking stones on the landscape, gradually enabled scholars to build up histories of the various empires who ruled over these landscapes in antiquity. Yet, with no way of accurately dating the Por Bajin complex, the identity of its builders remained a mystery for hundreds of years. Until now. In the 1950s, radiocarbon dating changed everything, allowing an entirely new and unprecedented window into the past. Carbon-14 dating, developed later, allowed for even more accurate readings, generally being precise to a few decades. Good enough for ancient history, though not so much as time goes on and it becomes ever more useful to pinpoint exact years to match up historical record to archaeological discovery. But maybe, in certain circumstances, this might be changing too. Just in the last decade, yet more developments in radiocarbon dating have allowed researchers to pinpoint individual spikes of carbon in the atmosphere at certain points in history. When combined with counting tree rings, allowing for even more accurate dating than ever before. In 2013, Japanese professor Fusa Miyake found a particular spike in carbon-14 content in the year 775. This spike can be detected in tree rings that grew around this time, each ring representing a year of growth. And thus, when wood is found at an archaeological site dating to this period, it can be dated accurately. Armed with this new information, and heavily suspecting the fortress to date to around the 8th or 9th centuries, a team of experts has been reinvestigating the Por Bajin complex, examining a beam taken from its foundations. The tree had 45 rings, followed by bark. The 43rd ring featured the massive carbon-14 spike, so that was the year 775. Which means this tree was cut 2 years later. Russian archaeologists had already determined that the complex was built quickly, in around 1 to 2 years. So it's highly likely that this date of 777 holds up for the entire structure. The time of the Uyghur Khanate. And who was the ruler, you may ask? Tengri Bogu Khan, a powerful steppe chieftain, most famous for converting to the then popular religion of Manichaeism, probably brought to his land along the Silk Road. Por Bajin was intended to be a monastery. Yet, as we shall see, as is often the case, Bogu's people didn't take too kindly to this new religion. But who was Mani? Back in the 3rd century AD, the still pagan Roman Empire's influence stretched from Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Its greatest enemy, the revitalized Persian Empire under the Sasanian Shahs, devout followers of Ahura Mazda, the deity of Zoroastrianism. It was into this confusing and world-shattering formative age that the prophet Mani was born, near the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. Little is known of Mani's early life, most of the texts relating to him having been destroyed down the ages. But no doubt a highly spiritual young man, after a religious epiphany in his mid-20s, like so many other prophets and religious figureheads throughout history, he began to write down his teachings, heavily basing them on, whilst attempting to supersede those of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism. His was a worldview based on rigid dualism, an eternal battle between good and evil. Mani eventually composed 6 works in Syriac. The final one, written in Persian, was presented to the Sasanian Shah, Shapur I, at least sympathetic towards him, if not an actual convert. Until 270, Mani was free to spread his teachings, gaining supporters far and wide throughout the Sasanian Empire. Shapur's successor, however, was less forgiving. Fearing the foreign influence rotting away the power of the ruling class, Bahram I had Mani captured and killed. Though later depicted by his followers as a crucifixion, Other accounts have it that he was flayed, his corpse suspended over the gate of the great city of Gundashapur. In death, Mani became immortal, his followers taking to the Silk Road to spread his teachings far beyond the Sasanian state, both east towards China, where many churches would be built in the coming centuries, and to the west, to the Roman Empire. Both regions where Christianity ever grew in popularity too. A time when any of the world religions could have won out. The Por Bajin complex had originally been dated to around 750 AD, based on a runic inscription called the Selenga stone, which described the construction of a vast complex. In 750, Bayan Chor Khan ruled the Uyghurs, and he was married to a Chinese princess, going some way to explain the clear Chinese influences long seen at the site. Although previous radiocarbon dates had already suggested the buildings to be ever so slightly younger, dating to the reign of Bayan Chor's son, Bogu, who took the throne in 759, amidst the violent chaos of the An Lushan rebellion, a continent-spanning civil war in China which drew the Uyghurs in on the side of the imperial government, against the charismatic rebel field marshal An Lushan. By 762, Bogu considered invading China himself with an army of 4,000 elite horsemen, ultimately assisting the Tang government instead against the rebels, contributing to the victory at the Battle of Luoyang, before sacking the city anyway, killing over 10,000 civilians and riding off with significant plunder, before extracting another 100,000 pieces of silk in order to leave Chinese territory. It was during this campaign, however, not long after his men burned down several Buddhist temples filled with Chinese civilians seeking refuge, that Bogu Khan encountered a number of Manichaeist missionaries. These strangers from the West must have had a significant impact on the Khan, for he converted not long afterwards, recruiting Manichaeist missionaries into his realm to bring the faith to his people, largely Tengriist followers of the sky god of the steppe. For a time, Manichaeism flourished, though strong opposition always remained, particularly amongst the nobility. Nevertheless, by 777, Bogu set about constructing this large monastery complex for his priests to go about their work in peace, perhaps copying the works of Mani, or even writing their own texts. By 779, however, urged on by his Sogdian courtiers, veterans of the politicking of the Silk Road, Bogu Khan decided to involve himself once more in Chinese affairs, riding to take advantage of newfound weakness in the Tang state. Resentment was strong, however, and an anti-Manichaean rebellion soon broke out, spearheaded by Bogu's uncle, Tun Baga Tarkan. And soon enough, Bogu, along with nearly 2,000 members of his family, courtiers, allies, and die-hard Manichaeists, were massacred, presumably including those situated here at Bogu's monastery. If the place had been a fortress, surely the new Khan would have taken it as his own. Instead, the place was abandoned for good. the new Khan implementing strict anti-Manichaeist laws, cracking down on the religion harshly. Yet, Manichaeism was much stronger than that. Pushed underground, like Christianity in the Roman Empire, it survived. And by the time of the next Khan, arose once more to become the state religion, remaining so until the overthrow of the Uyghur state in the mid-9th century. The Uyghur state would soon be gone, replaced by newer steppe confederations. Though the faith of Mani would survive too, remaining a powerful force along the Silk Road and on into the plains of Asia, until finally, in the 14th century, as a result of the rise of the Mongol war machine, a state which eventually converted to Islam, and the strangling of outside influence by the Ming dynasty of China, the last followers of the faith finally died out. At around the same time as the last Christian churches of China fell out of use too. The Uyghurs would go on to have a long and fascinating history of their own, moving on to the Tarim Basin, and, like their Mongol cousins, eventually converting to Islam. A religion with a lot more bargaining power, given the strength of the Middle Eastern powers. Today, some 10 million Uyghurs exist in the world. Several millions of these living in Chinese internment camps. Only time will tell what the future holds. You've been watching Archaeology News. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you on the next one.